Two executives, same credentials, same track record, same job title. But one walks away with a $30 million advantage over their career. Why? Because when the stakes were highest, when everything came down to a single interview, they didn't wing it. They treated that moment like the financial negotiation of a lifetime. In this episode, we're going to break down the neuroscience, performance psychology, and financial mechanisms behind elite executive interview performance. And if you think your experience alone will carry you through, that assumption could cost you more than you realize. This isn't about getting a job. It's about recalibrating your entire wealth trajectory. Let's get into it.
If you look across the executive landscape, you see this paradox that is, it's financially staggering.
It really is.
You've got two executives, and on paper, they look almost identical. Same credentials, same industry experience, decades of quantifiable success.
Right, they're peers in every sense of the word.
But then you track their careers, and one of them is just on this wealth trajectory that completely out-earns the other.
And we're not talking about small amounts. The gap can be $20, $30 million, sometimes even more over a lifetime.
It's huge. And if you ask most people why does this happen, you get the usual answers.
You do. They'll say, oh, it's about negotiation skill, or maybe it's just the raw performance of the companies they happen to lead.
But when you actually look at the research, that intuition just doesn't hold up.
Not at all.
There was an analysis at Harvard that found that the actual performance of the company, its success, explains only about 4% of the difference in CEO pay.
4%. It's almost a rounding error.
Yeah. So the real leverage point, the sort of hidden multiplier, it rests on something far more personal and honestly a lot more fragile.
Comes down to a very specific, very high stakes performance event. One that happens, maybe 4 or 5 times in an entire career.
The executive interview.
That's it. And this deep dive is all about the science behind that one specific event. It's about how to transform what a lot of really accomplished executives treat as just a minor inconvenience.
Yeah, a hurdle to get over.
Exactly. A perishable skill, and turn it into a strategic, wealth-generating asset.
So our mission today is really to get past that generalized advice of, you should be good at interviewing. We want to dive into the specific science-backed how you actually achieve exceptional performance when the stakes are at their absolute highest.
And for this, we're drawing on some really comprehensive sources. We're integrating cognitive neuroscience, performance psychology, even principles from military training, and of course, hard financial data.
All to explain the mechanism.
The mechanism. And when we talk about mechanisms, we're talking about tangible compensation premiums. We are talking about the difference between getting a standard market bump in salary and getting an offer that actually triggers what's called discretionary authority.
And that difference translates into, what were the numbers?
It can translate into a potential $16 million to $48 million addition to your career's total earnings.
Those numbers are just astronomical. And it's wild to think they all pivot on just a handful of conversations.
That's the key. These are career inflection points. This isn't about your annual performance review. It's about those moments of transition. The interview performance only really activates at these critical junctures. The moment you move from a VP to an SVP, or from managing director to president, or you switch companies entirely.
These are the rare windows where your compensation can be fundamentally reset.
Exactly. This is where the hiring authority decides, based almost purely on how you perform in that room, whether you are worth securing above and beyond the standard pre-approved salary band.
And that leads us straight into the foundational risk, doesn't it? The reason so many incredibly accomplished executives accidentally set themselves up for, catastrophic failure.
It does. Interviewing is, by its very nature, a perishable skill.
It just rusts over.
It atrophies, and it atrophies incredibly fast. Look, executives are masters of complex, high-stakes situations. They handle board presentations, crisis management, huge negotiations.
Things they do all the time. Daily, weekly.
Right. But they might only interview once every 5, maybe 7 years. So they're relying on this long history of general success to manage a very specific skill that is fundamentally decayed.
The rust is real.
The data on these kinds of complex cognitive skills, we're talking verbal fluency, numerical recall, structured storytelling, it suggests there's an overwhelming likelihood of being totally gone after 6 months if you don't do specific deliberate practice. And that decay is the root cause. It's why executives end up winging the highest leverage conversations of their careers. They mistake their past professional competence for current interview readiness. And the opportunity cost of that rust just compounds year after year.
So let's unpack this. I mean, it seems like an irrational preparation paradox, right? Why does an executive who's so meticulous about strategy, about financial planning, why do they approach their most financially important hour with this attitude of, I'll just wing it?
It's a fascinating question.
They'll practice for weeks for a board presentation that might, move the stock a couple of points or slightly adjust their annual bonus, a presentation that fundamentally cannot change their base compensation.
But for the 1 hour that can transform their entire lifetime earnings,
They just rely on old experience.
the answer is in this fundamental disconnect between the executive's conscious confidence, their ego, and the brain's deep automatic performance systems.
So it's not a lack of experience that makes them fail.
No, it's because their neurocognitive performance systems literally collapse under the pressure of what's called evaluative threat. They're trusting their experienced ego to solve what is, at its core, a neurological problem.
This is where understanding the value of that failure mechanism is so critical, isn't it? You have to know how the system is designed to break down before you can build the defenses.
You absolutely do. And the neurology hits you with a very rapid sequence of failure mechanisms.
The first one being,
The first one is catastrophic. It's cognitive load collapse. An executive interview is quite possibly the single most demanding cognitive event they face.
more than a hostile negotiation, more than a crisis.
In many ways, yes, because it requires a massive amount of simultaneous high-demand tasks. You have to listen to the question and decode the interviewer's specific intent. At the same time, you have to rapidly access your long-term memory for specific quantified metric
Then build a compelling story around it in real time.
in real time, while also regulating all your nonverbal cues. It is the ultimate multitasking scenario, and it's happening under a giant spotlight.
Right, and the brain can only handle so much at once.
Exactly. So, to use an analogy, your brain has a fixed amount of immediate processing power. Cognitive neuroscientists call this working memory. Just think of it like the limited RAM in your computer. For an unprepared executive, every single one of those demands building the story, searching for the revenue numbers from 3 years ago, managing the anxiety, it's all eating up that limited RAM.
Then why it's overloaded?
The system stalls. Or even worse, it crashes.
And by the crash, you mean the things we can actually see. The halting speech, the rambling answers that just lose focus, the inability to pull up a key number that should be top of mind.
That's it, exactly. Research consistently confirms that when working memory is taxed, whether it's by stress or just too many demands, performance on complex verbal tasks just deteriorates immediately.
So what's the first thing to go?
Your fluency, your ability to build a narrative, and your recall of non-intuitive numbers. Those are the first casualties. Stress literally reduces the cognitive resources you have available for articulate, high-level speech.
I can hear a top executive pushing back on this, though. They'd say, look, I have to trust my ego in a high-stakes crisis. That's what I do. Why is an interview so fundamentally different from, say, presenting a hostile takeover defense to a board of directors?
That is a brilliant question, and it's a crucial distinction. The difference is the second mechanism, preconscious threat activation. The interview context triggers a very specific, very ancient circuit in the brain that is far more automatic and primitive than presenting to a known group, even a hostile one. We're talking about the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system.
And this is where the timeline of failure gets, frankly, a little bit shocking.
It is shocking because it completely undermines our self-perception of being in control. The amygdala decides you are under a social evaluative threat faster than your conscious mind can even register what's happening.
How fast are we talking?
Threat signals reach the amygdala in as little as 12 to 120 milliseconds. It is almost instantaneous.
And our conscious awareness of that, the part where we think, oh, this is an evaluation, that takes how long?
That takes 280 to 410 milliseconds.
So the consequence of that is profound.
It is. It means your brain has already decided you're in danger before you've consciously registered the handshake or the first question or even your first thought about the interview. The performance degradation begins before you have a chance to intellectually override it.
So an executive walks into the room feeling intellectually prepared, they feel confident, but neurologically their system has already shifted into fight or flight.
That's the mechanism, simply because they're being judged by strangers who control their financial future. Social evaluative threat being judged with high consequence activates the same deep subcortical systems as physical danger.
So by the time they consciously think, wait, why am I rambling? Or why can't I find this simple number? It's already too late.
It's too late. Their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex reasoning and fluency, has already been compromised by that automatic threat response. The cognitive collapse is invisible to the executive while it is happening.
And that's the dangerous blind spot we talked about. They're relying on their history of success in other high stakes situations that just aren't the same neurologically.
And the ego cannot override this primal neurology. It just can't. Their confidence is built on contexts like, presenting to a board they know or managing a crisis where they have inherent authority. Those things don't trigger the same high-intensity social evaluative threat circuits.
The amygdala doesn't check your resume before it fires.
It does not consult your self-assessment before firing. That feeling of, I'm successful, I'm competent, this won't affect me, is neurologically irrelevant to the system deciding whether you are safe or threatened.
So an executive could be totally composed during a $100 million negotiation, but still experience this rapid threat activation during a job interview.
Absolutely. Just because the power dynamic and the context of external judgment are different. And that brings us to the final piece of this failure trap.
Which is,
Stress doesn't create new problems. It simply amplifies the weaknesses that are already there, lying dormant.
that's a critical distinction, I think, for any executive who values self-improvement. It's not that the pressure makes you incompetent.
No, it just makes your lack of practice impossible to hide.
Can you give an analogy for that?
Sure, think about elite, high-stakes training in other fields. Combat doesn't magically make a soldier incompetent. What it does is reveal the unaddressed weaknesses. Maybe it's an unpracticed procedure, a psychological vulnerability, a lack of stamina that suddenly become catastrophic failures under pressure. It's the same for the executive. The one who hasn't practiced their quantified achievement stories for 7 years doesn't suddenly develop poor articulation in the interview. Those skills atrophied from disuse, leaving these little cognitive gaps.
And the evaluative threat just acts as a giant amplifier.
A powerful amplifier, exactly. It magnifies the hesitation, the vague language, the disfluency that were already lying dormant.
So the unprepared executive is facing a kind of double jeopardy. Their skills have atrophied from years of disuse, and indeed the interview environment acts as a stress amplifier for whatever weaknesses are left.
And this is why implementation is so crucial. It's precisely why advanced training methodologies in high-stakes sales or law enforcement, for example, they design sessions to intentionally trigger what they call backup behaviors.
What are backup behaviors?
They're the defensive, reactive, fight, flight, freeze patterns we all retreat to under stress. For an executive, that's the rambling, the hedging, the over-explaining. Until you identify those patterns, surface them, and practice your way through them in a safe setting, you simply cannot override them under real pressure.
So the preparation is really about identifying and eliminating these weaknesses before you get into the high-stakes performance.
It's about eliminating the amplifiable weaknesses before they have a chance to sabotage your career and, frankly, cost you millions of dollars.
Okay, so we have a very clear picture of the neurological problem. Stress hijacks your working memory, performance collapses. So the next step is obvious. How do we operationalize performance? How do you build skills that are resilient enough to survive that threat activation and just flow freely under pressure?
The solution is really twofold, and it requires implementation that's based squarely on cognitive science. First, you have to achieve automaticity.
Automaticity. Let's define that really clearly. It sounds a bit like jargon, but it feels like it's the key to having that mental freedom during the interview.
It is. Automaticity is the ability to execute a complex task, in this case, telling an ROI-rich structured achievement story without consuming your limited working memory.
So you're taking it off the main processor.
Exactly. If the task is automatic, it operates on a procedural level. That frees up your cognitive capacity, your RAM, to focus on higher order things like strategic thinking, actually reading the interviewer.
And that transition is everything. You're shifting the task away from that vulnerable, high-friction prefrontal cortex, which gets compromised by stress, to the faster, more robust, long-term memory systems.
Precisely. When a skill becomes automatic, control transitions from the executive processor to procedural memory.
Mm,
It preserves your cognitive capacity. It's like driving a car.
right?
When you first learned, just changing gears consumed all of your focus. That's a high working memory load.
Mm,
Now you can change gears, talk on hands-free call, plan what you're having for dinner
all at the same time.
simultaneously. Our motor skill is now automatic. We need to proceduralize executive narrative delivery in the exact same way.
So the value here is clear. Achieving automaticity is basically like giving yourself a brain capacity upgrade right before the most stressful professional moment of your career change.
That's the perfect way to put it.
So, how much practice does it really take? We know just thinking about it that mental rehearsal isn't enough.
Mental rehearsal is a cognitive trap. It creates the illusion of competence, but it doesn't build the neural pathways.
So, you feel prepared, but you're not.
You're not. Automaticity is only achieved through specific, deliberate, out loud verbal production. You have to say the words.
And is there a threshold, a magic number?
The research across all kinds of domains, from military simulations to verbal fluency training, consistently converges on a specific repetition threshold. You need 10 to 15 high-quality repetitions per achievement story.
10 to 15 times, out loud.
Out loud and spaced out over 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay, so if an executive needs, say, 10 to 12 core achievement stories prepared, that's 150 repetitions, minimum, just to build that foundational automaticity.
That's correct. And leading firms know this. You see firms like EY and Deloitte, they emphasize preparing 10 to 15 core achievement stories, and they have to be structured narratives.
Using frameworks like STAR or SOAR.
Exactly. Situation, task, action, result, or situation, obstacle, action, result. With the quantified results woven in explicitly, the fluency only develops when you force the verbal production, record yourself, and correct the inevitable stumbles.
And you mentioned spacing is non-negotiable, which really challenges that executive tendency to just cram everything into a weekend.
The power of spacing is a critical neurological insight that high achievers often ignore. Massed practice, cramming 20 hours into one high-intensity weekend produces a much weaker, more fragile automaticity.
Why is that?
Because memory consolidation requires spacing and rest intervals, especially sleep. That's what strengthens the memory traces and proceduralizes the skill in the deeper, more stress-resistant parts of the brain. You simply cannot rush neurological consolidation.
So repetition builds the skill, spacing locks it into the stress-resistant part of the brain. But even with these automatic stories, we still haven't really dealt with that amygdala hijack, have we? How do you build resistance to that evaluative threat?
That's where the second implementation solution comes in, stress inoculation.
Okay.
And the first part of that is realizing that practice alone produces pretty modest gains. Practice with expert counselor feedback produces exponentially better results.
Why is the feedback so important?
Because the feedback mechanism is essential for identifying the things you can't see yourself. The nonverbal cues, the little disfluencies, the gaps in your narrative that you just gloss over. Your internal monitor is compromised by your own self-assessment bias.
This sounds very similar to what high-stakes performance organizations do. They don't just teach you the theory, they put you under controlled pressure.
That is the core value of stress inoculation training, or SIT. The military, law enforcement, think about the FBI's rigorous integrated case scenarios. They use graduated exposure to realistic stressors to build tolerance and resilience. The goal is to get you habituated to the evaluative context.
And what does that look like for an executive preparing for an interview?
It means structured, realistic mock interviews. And it's not just about answering questions. It's practicing under time constraints, with skeptical interviewers asking tough questions designed to probe your specific vulnerabilities, just like a real search firm partner would.
You're practicing in an environment designed to trigger the very stress response you're trying to manage.
Exactly. You're inoculating yourself against it.
And is there a sweet spot for how many sessions are needed to get that inoculation?
There is. The research suggests that structured exposure to this evaluative context, typically through about 6 to 7 sessions of high-quality mock interviews with expert high-fidelity feedback, significantly reduces performance anxiety and enhances your performance under real stress.
And that feedback spots the subtle tells, right? The fidgeting, the lack of eye contact, the speech rate getting too fast.
All the subtle nonverbal anxiety cues that an interviewer will unconsciously interpret as a lack of competence, regardless of how qualified you actually are. You're systematically eliminating the errors caused by stress.
This really brings us back to that famous military quote, doesn't it? It ties this need for rigorous, often uncomfortable preparation directly to success.
It's the perfect parallel. Navy SEAL Commander Richard Marcinko's statement, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. The preparation forces the executive to confront their own discomfort and vulnerabilities, the lack of fluency, the missing numbers, the tendency to ramble, but in a safe training environment.
So that when they face the real thing,
When they face the pressure of the actual career-defining interview, those fundamental skills don't just survive, they flow automatically. And that preserves their cognitive capacity for the strategic, high-level dialogue that actually wins the job. The implementation of automaticity and inoculation guarantees performance under fire. So once you've systematically engineered that automaticity and stress inoculation, the entire purpose of preparation shifts. It's no longer just a defensive mechanism to prevent failure. It becomes a proactive value creation mechanism.
and the first way it creates value is through what you call cognitive fluency.
Right, and cognitive fluency is the foundation of trust.
Okay, so how does the science define the value of that fluency for an executive who's trying to get a premium offer?
Cognitive fluency is simply the ease with which the interviewer's brain can process the information you're giving them. When you're prepared, your narrative just flows effortlessly. It's structured linearly, and it eliminates any need for the listener to pause or reorder information or try to fill in gaps in their head.
And that ease of processing has an immediate and unconscious impact on how credible the interviewer finds you.
That is the critical insight. It's driven by something called the fluency heuristic. When an executive is hard to follow, they're hesitating, using vague language, their stories are disjointed, the interviewer's brain interprets that processing difficulty as a validity threat.
So they don't consciously think, I'm having trouble following this.
No, not on a conscious level. Their brain unconsciously triggers a signal that says, something's not quite right here. This person seems confusing, maybe they're being evasive, or maybe they don't really understand their own impact.
So the core value proposition of fluency is that information that's easy to process is judged as more truthful, more competent, and more credible. So you could have two candidates with identical business results, but the one who delivers them fluently is perceived as the superior executive.
100%. Fluency determines credibility perception. And this is why we emphasized structured narratives like SARE situation, obstacle, action, result.
Right, because the executive knows all the backstory, but the interviewer knows nothing.
Exactly, that's the backstory problem. The SARE structure forces you to be linear and to explicitly highlight the obstacle you overcame. And that's crucial because value is derived from overcoming difficulty. If the interviewer never has to pause and think, wait, what was the actual challenge here?
Fair.
Then they stay engaged and their trust in you remains high.
So fluency, which you build through repetition, leads to credibility. And that credibility leads directly to the second major value mechanism, strategic information control.
Which is, operationally speaking, what defines true executive presence.
So how does that work?
Well, the ability to control information is the direct countermeasure to the single biggest failure mode for unprepared executives, which is talking too much.
The rambling.
The rambling. When anxiety and cognitive overload take over, the executive over-explains and completely surrenders control of the dialogue. They start speaking in paragraphs, sometimes for 5 or 7 minutes straight.
Why did I do that?
Because their working memory is entirely consumed with just trying to construct the story. There's no capacity left to monitor the interviewer's reaction or to gauge if they've actually answered the question.
And that's where that incredible anecdote you showed before comes in. It just perfectly illustrates this collapse of strategic control.
It's a perfect encapsulation of failure through sheer volume. We had the president of a $10 billion business unit, an executive with $10 million signature authority, interviewing the senior exec for a critical role.
Okay.
The interview was scheduled for 90 minutes. When he was asked for his assessment afterward, the president just said, I don't know.
He didn't know after 90
Liz
minutes.
didn't know. The candidate had given such long, rambling, information-dense answers that the president only managed to get through 3 of his 10 critical assessment questions.
So the candidate, who was obviously accomplished, basically talked themselves out of a job. They used up all the available time with non-strategic noise.
They controlled the time, but they surrendered the strategic narrative. And that's the key. Executive presence is the perception created when an executive operates with available cognitive capacity. That capacity is what enables strategic control of information.
Because their stories are automatic.
Exactly. The 10 to 15 repetitions freed up their working memory entirely for strategic thought. Concision, directness, clarity over just verbose explanation.
So a prepared executive answers precisely. They can read the nonverbal cues from the interviewer. They know when to stop talking.
And they pivot to ask strategic dialogue advancing questions of their own.
This strategic control is what we perceive as C-suite communication. That clarity, that brevity, that confidence.
This is the critical output. This is what creates the perception of true executive judgment. That sense that the organization cannot afford not to secure this candidate.
And that perception, built on neurological fluency and strategic control, is what unlocks the third and most valuable mechanism.
Discretionary compensation authority.
We've established that exceptional performance can reset the compensation band. But for a hiring authority to actually approve a premium offer, one that goes way over the standard budget, they need an airtight justification, right?
They do. And this is the difference between getting a standard market bump and triggering a multi-million-dollar premium. Hiring authorities have board-approved authority to exceed the standard comp bands, but only when the ROI justification is so compelling that it mitigates the political risk of them overpaying.
So the executive has to provide that undeniable business case in the interview itself.
They must, and they have to frame their achievements using the precise language of business.
Not just, we did a good job, but real, quantitative, impact-focused results.
Precisely. Instead of saying, I led a major operational turnaround, the prepared executive fluently delivers. I drove margin expansion that increased EBITDA by $28 million over 18 months, delivering an 800% return on the project investment while simultaneously reducing operational cycle time by 37%.
That fluency and precision are non-negotiable.
They are. So those specific quantified metrics aren't just details. They are the documented evidence that the hiring authority requires to exercise that discretionary approval. The interview has to make the ROI of hiring you completely undeniable.
And without that structured, fluent, quantified articulation, which, as you said, can only come from the automaticity built through those 10 to 15 repetitions, the justification just falls apart.
It does. The hiring authority defaults to the standard pay band because they simply lack the specific, articulate evidence they need to risk going above budget. The value of this preparation is the difference between locking in the baseline offer and triggering the premium.
Okay, let's get really concrete about the investment that's needed to get these outcomes. The automaticity, the stress inoculation, the fluent business case. We're talking about focused time and often a financial investment and specialized support. What does that time commitment actually look like?
Based on all the research and best practices, to achieve truly transformational performance, you need a budget for 15 to 20 hours of focused preparation.
15 to 20 hours.
And it has to be strategically spaced out, maybe over 4 to 6 weeks. This isn't just theory. This is the labor required for a genuine neurological recalibration.
And how does that time break down in practical terms for, a busy executive?
It usually breaks down into 3 distinct phases. First, you'll need about 5 to 7 hours just from writing out the detailed achievement stories. You're making sure they're structured with SR, and you're extracting those highly specific quantified metrics.
Okay, that's the foundation.
The second phase is another 5 to 7 hours of intense verbal rehearsal. This is where you're doing the 10 to 15 repetitions for each story, often recording yourself and then reviewing those recordings to catch any disfluency.
And the third piece.
That's 3 to 5 hours of high-fidelity mock interviews with professional feedback. That's the stress inoculation phase we talked about.
When you lay it out like that, it's a relatively small investment of time, maybe a couple of weekends or an hour a night for a month, for what could be a massive potential return.
It is.
So let's quantify that ROI. Let's use some conservative numbers.
Okay, we establish that a systematically prepared executive can achieve about a 30% compensation lift, compared to the standard 10% market bump an unprepared executive might get.
Right. So let's start with a $200,000 executive who makes this investment.
And let's say that executive invests maybe $3,500 in total. That covers their time and the cost of the necessary expert coaching.
Okay.
By achieving that 30% lift, they're moving from $200,000 to $260,000. That's a $60,000 first-year premium, on top of the standard $20,000 bump.
So the ROI on that $3,500 investment is?
It's extraordinary. It's a return of 1,714% in the first year alone, just from that single event.
That is just staggering. The preparation cost is recouped instantly, many, many times over, but the true value, the real wealth creation, is in the compounding effect over a whole career.
This is where the numbers become almost unbelievable.
This is where we look at the long-term financial model.
Exactly. So let's compare that $200,000 executive who moves to $220,000. That's the standard 10% lift versus the prepared one who moves to $260,000. And let's just assume a conservative 5% annual raise for 5 years in that one single new role.
The compounding starts on day one. The 220,000 executive sees their salary base creep up.
Yes, but the $260,000 executive is accelerating from a fundamentally higher baseline. After just 5 years in that single role, the cumulative compensation difference between those two trajectories is approximately $220,000.
$220,000 lost simply by being unprepared for one interview that probably lasted 90 minutes.
It's a massive opportunity cost.
And this is the critical point. That new higher baseline of $260,000 is what they then negotiate from in their next transition. The preparedness acts as a kind of perpetual motion machine for higher wealth.
Exactly right. And over 4 or 5 of those career inflection points, this compounding effect leads directly to those projected $16 million to $48 million lifetime wealth differentials we cited at the beginning.
The evidence seems unambiguous. 20 hours of strategic preparation at a career inflection point determines which wealth-building trajectory you lock yourself into.
The value is undeniable. The return is mathematically modeled.
That preparation, though, it often requires some really specialized guidance. So let's talk about the coach selection imperative, because just hiring any executive coach who focuses on, say, leadership dynamics probably isn't going to address the specific neurological challenge we've been discussing.
This is probably the highest leverage decision an executive makes in this whole process. Most executive coaches are fantastic at what they do. Leadership development, organizational dynamics, general career counseling.
All valuable things.
Very valuable.
Yeah.
But they are not built on a performance methodology designed to tackle the neurological challenge of interview performance under evaluative threat. You need a coach who understands how to help you trigger discretionary compensation authority.
And that requires a really rare trifecta of specialized expertise, doesn't it? Knowledge of the system from both sides of the hiring equation.
It does. The coach who can deliver these kinds of premium results typically possesses 3 rarely overlapping competencies. First is executive hiring authority experience.
Meaning they've actually sat in the chair.
They've sat in the seat, they've made high-consequence hiring decisions, they have personally approved compensation above the standard bands, and they understand the political and financial justification needed to do that. They know the signals that trigger confidence.
They know the exact language that allows them to go to the board and say, this candidate is worth the premium.
Absolutely. The second competency is retained executive search partner experience. Having assessed hundreds, if not thousands, of candidates gives them crucial calibration. They know what separates the top 5% of interview performers in terms of presence, fluency, and business articulation.
So they can reverse engineer the hiring authority's decision process.
Yes, and they understand the subtle subconscious patterns that predict success in these high-stakes environments. And finally, and this is crucial, they must have a proven preparation methodology.
One that goes beyond just generic advice.
It has to be systematic and research-backed. Spaced repetition scheduling, stress inoculation role-playing, structured narrative building. And, critically, they have to be able to demonstrate world-class responses by role-playing as the candidate themselves.
They have to show you what great looks like.
They have to show you what exceptional looks like, not just critique your failures. If a coach can't fluently and concisely deliver a quantified, SR-structured story in the moment, they cannot teach the automaticity required for you to achieve it under stress.
The cost difference for this kind of specialized expertise can be substantial. As you noted, elite coaches might have retainers of $50,000 or more, which is far above a generalist coach. How do you justify that kind of investment?
You justify with math we just went through.
Yeah.
If a generic coach helps you get the standard 10% bump, that's great. The ROI is still there. But if an elite specialized coach helps you trigger discretionary authority that results in, say, a double the standard offer, for that $200K executive, that's $1 million+ return over 5 years.
So the ROI is still massive.
It's still substantial, maybe 20.1 to 100.1. The question isn't about the absolute cost of the coach. It's about their capability to solve what is, for you, a multi-million-dollar career differential. Preparation only works if the coaching is expert enough to address the neurological and strategic complexity of the high-stakes evaluation.
So this entire deep dive has revealed something really fundamental, I think. Executive interview performance. It's not about natural talent or charisma or just being a smooth talker. It's about understanding human performance systems and system design.
It's about recognizing that interviewing is a complex cognitive performance event that happens under acute neurological stress. The failure happens unconsciously. Your ego's confidence is, frankly, irrelevant to your brain's threat detector.
Which activates before you're even consciously aware of it and just amplifies all your existing weaknesses.
Exactly. And understanding that setup is the first crucial step to maximizing your career value.
And the solution is entirely systematic. It's implementation. It's about rebuilding that perishable skill through deliberate, structured practice. We establish the key metrics for success. Automaticity requires 10 to 15 high quality, spaced repetitions per story.
And stress resistance is built through 3 to 5 mock interview exposures with expert, high fidelity feedback.
Success is entirely quantifiable. That operation frees up your cognitive capacity. It enables that concise, fluent, strategic dialogue that signals executive judgment.
And it provides the undeniable business case using the language of EBITDA and ROI that is required to trigger discretionary compensation authority. This preparation turns your past achievements into an undeniable argument for a premium offer, and that unlocks career value that compounds over decades.
We started this by asking why executives with similar credentials and experience can so dramatically out-earn their peers. And the answer is the systematic preparation, or the catastrophic lack of it, at that handful of career inflection points that determine your financial baseline for years to come.
Most executives will continue to spend hours, maybe days, workshopping board presentations that cannot move their base compensation. The evidence we've reviewed today is absolutely clear. 20 hours of strategic, science-backed interview preparation at a career inflection point is what determines which wealth-building trajectory you lock yourself into. The research is unambiguous.
So the choice for you, the listener, is simple.
It is. What's the quantifiable ROI of the preparation you commit to for your next career-defining conversation?